So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
Pope Francis has offended pet lovers everywhere. At a church near you, online, you name it. From the spinster cat ladies to the dog moms, all the way to people who are struggling with infertility. He's really, according to social media, has dug a hole on this one. We're going to talk about the Pope's recent comments, which that would be actually the headline that you're seeing on social media and by the media with regard to what Pope Francis said this week at his general audience about having children and how people choose to be dog moms, animal parents, in lieu of having a child. So stay tuned. Joining me in just a little bit to discuss this will be Father Tim Grumbach here on Trending with Timmerie, heard on Relevant Radio. Be sure, if you're not going to catch the conversation, I'd love to hear from you. At least leave your comment of your thoughts on this whole conversation. You can give us a call, 1-888-914-9149, or you can comment now on my Instagram. I put a question and comment box up on Instagram. I would love to get your thoughts on this, especially because we're going to unpack kind of this attitude today that we've discussed here on Trending, but I heard another version of it, and that is this idea that, basically plants have replaced pets. Pets have replaced children, and children are basically for people who are elitists, wealthy, rich, and those are the people who are privileged enough to have kids. You think that's true or false? So please go answer some of the questions. I posted them on my Instagram. I'd love to share your thoughts. You can also give me a call, 1-888-914-9149. Coming up, we're also going to discuss some questions about in-law relationships. A ton of questions, hot and heavy right after the holidays. And I know a lot of people with frequency of timing together. One Catholic take on this. And did you know that in light of in-law relationships, that there's actually a whole book in the Bible that has to do with in-laws? Do you know which book that is? Don't Google it. Maybe you can call and tell me or comment on social media. Let us know. You can call in and tell my producer. Patrick's waiting to take your call. Again, the number's 1-888-914-9149. A question came through on Instagram that I wanted to answer here because I think it's so important, whether you're in the dating scene or you know someone who's dating, single, been through a recent breakup, any of that. The question is, how do you know when you're ready to date again? Now, there are many dimensions of this. The comment was emotionally, mentally, spiritually. I thought, good for you for recognizing that it's not just kind of this attitude of, okay, I've been dumped or I broke up with someone and I'm ready to jump right in because I'm single. If that's your mindset, that is, singleness equates dating again, I think that's a red flag. And I think that that's kind of the attitude that our culture has. If I'm single, then it's time to start dating again. Now, that could be because of pressure that other people externally place on single people. I always hate that question or comment. If you're single or even if you're dating someone, every holiday, every time you get together with certain people, and maybe I'll just argue 95% of people, they would always ask, oh, are you dating anyone? Or, oh, when are you getting married? Are you guys talking about marriage? All great questions, but at times insensitive because it puts pressure on some people to date when they're not quite ready yet. That said, not enough people are looking toward marriage when it comes to dating, and some people have stepped out of the dating scene altogether because they've lost hope in a long-term committed relationship that is marriage with children, which is why we're going to discuss having kids in just a little bit and Pope Francis' recent comments about having kids versus being cat lady, dog mom, you name it. Bring on the hate mail. I'm not saying, I haven't said yet or explained what Pope Francis actually said, but according to social media, he's offended spinster cat ladies everywhere. So, back to our question, how to know if you're ready to date again. Great question on Instagram from Isabella. So I think that starting first and foremost, it's important that we're understanding, like I said, you're not just thinking single equates time to date. Especially if you're a man, it's very important that you're marriage material. Now, Isabella, that's a different perspective. I think in terms of being marriage material as a woman versus a man needs to have the means to provide. And the woman needs to have that sacrificial heart and prepared attitude when it comes to being open to life, to carrying babies, to letting go of things in life for the sake of having children. It's very, very important. It's a big sacrifice on the part of a mother, on the part of a woman, on the part of a wife. And it's a big sacrifice on the part of the man to be prepared not only to pony up and marry a woman and be marriage material, pay down debt, all of these things that I think a lot of people are jumping into dating relationships and they're not really taking seriously, something such as struggling with looking at pornography, something such as not being in any state whatsoever to be financially responsible enough to pay your bills or start to pay down debt. I know so many people who say, well, when I start dating someone that I really like and I'm interested in marrying them, well, then I will stop smoking. Then I'll start working on paying down my student loans. But actually, my argument is whether it's emotional, mental, spiritual, financial, we should be preparing ourselves for marriage before we're even dating. And it's so important. Now, how do you know if you're ready to date, quote, again? Of course, you need to make sure that this isn't any sort of rebound relationship, that you're not looking for attention, that you're not seeking dating out of a place of loneliness, out of a place of needing to feel like you're with someone, out of a place of maybe having a little bit of a sexual pull and addiction, or you're looking to channel certain desires. All of this, we have to understand that you don't want to be in any sort of codependent relationship, you on other people or vice versa. This is so important. And so again, that's kind of the emotional side, making sure you've let go of past relationships and you've let go of any desperate needs of certain types of attachments. And this does take some soul searching, self-awareness, pondering, journaling, talking to other people, maybe even getting other perspectives from other people outside of yourself and the relationships that you have been in. The other perspective is mentally, again, that has to do with discerning marriage, having the capacity to say no when in challenging circumstances, especially surrounding intimacy, especially, I think this is another important thing, that you're not just chasing marriage, that when you discern marriage with a particular person. I think sometimes we have it wrong when we're like, I know I'm going to be married. I have to be married. And you're so focused on this idea of marriage that in some ways I think it detracts us from saying yes to a specific person and discerning a particular person because we're so focused on marriage and trying to slide that person into that category that can get us there. And so being able to say no when things don't work out after having gone on a few dates, sure, the person might be good looking, sure, he might be a great guy or an incredible woman, but there just isn't the right match there for you. It's okay to say no and not be afraid of it. And that takes being objective, not creating soul ties and chemical bonds through sexual intimacy outside of marriage. That requires self-control. If you know yourself to not really have a lot of self-control, if you find that you tend to be very emotionally attached to people within the wrong way, these are all maybe red flags to do a little bit of work. We mentioned last year that even some of the Kardashians during 2020 actually decided to go on dating cleanses. We talked about Khloe here on Trending and others who are choosing to do the same thing. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, I'm making a commitment to not dating for 6 months. Maybe there's someone who comes along and you're interested. You can also communicate, hey, I'm not just interested in being friends right now. I've decided just to give myself some time. I really do need to wait about 6 months to start dating again, to work on a few things, just a little while longer, and kind of have that approach. If someone is really meant to be, I don't think you're going to deter someone because you're asking them to wait 2 more months because you're almost through your 6 months, or even 5 months where you can get to know each other in a different type of setting. And I think finally, when it comes to this question of how do you know when you're ready to date again, one of the big things that was important for me during my single years was that I was in a state of place working to grow in my spiritual life and be very open. And I always hate that phrase spiritual life because our spiritual life is our whole life. But understanding that integration, that I am created by God and God has chosen you, He has chosen me to be his daughter or son. And that there's an element of belonging to God, of understanding that loving relationship as a child before the Father. This is very important. I remember a nun once came and gave a talk at the university I went to, John Paul the Great Catholic University. And she said that when she was living in the convent, or as she lives in the convent, every night she tries to pass by the chapel where our Lord Jesus Christ is present in the tabernacle, there in the Eucharist. And every single night, as if she were married to our Lord Jesus Christ, she would stop by the chapel and say a brief prayer. And she'd talk about it as a means, just as a spouse would kiss their spouse goodnight before they go to bed or goodbye before they leave the house, that it was this act of love and union with our Lord Jesus Christ. I think this is why it's so important for all of us, whether married or single, to have a crucifix in our bedroom, in various parts of our home, where we have that pause and that moment of recognizing that before I can belong to anyone else, I first belong to God. That I've made this relationship that I've continued to develop and nourish because God has first sought us, and we need to seek him back, which will better prepare us to enter into other relationships. Great question. I love taking your questions. If you have a question, the number is 1-888-914-9149. Okay, Lori from Austin, Texas. Let's see. Which book of the Bible has to do with in-law relationships? We're going to talk about it in a little bit here on Trending.
I believe it's Ruth.
You are correct. The Book of Ruth. So if you're wondering and maybe you're frustrated over in-law situations from the last few months of frequency with the holidays, tons of questions have been coming in on this. We have a Catholic take, and we're going to dive a little bit into sacred scripture. So stay with me in just a little bit. Joining me now is Father Tim Grumbach here on Relevant Radio. He is the pastor and chaplain at Bishop Alemany High School in the Diocese of Los Angeles. Now, you may have heard it's everywhere from Fox News to Vice to Forbes magazine, you name it. Everyone is talking about the fact that Pope Francis has offended pet lovers everywhere. From dog moms to spinster cat women to people who are struggling with fertility and infertility. Now, that's the media headline that you'll hear. Many people are commenting, he doesn't even have children, so how can he say that you need to have kids? Joining me now to talk about this is Father Tim Grumbach here on Relevant Radio. Father Tim, I want to dive into a little bit of what Pope Francis actually said to set the record straight and why he said what he did. But first, welcome to Trending.
Thanks for having me on, as always. And one of my favorite responses to all of this is, if you didn't like what Pope Francis had to say, you're really going to hate what St. Thomas Aquinas has to say. It's the delightful Twitter back and forth between the Dominicans and the Franciscans about whether or not an animal's soul survives death. But maybe that's a whole other conversation.
I'll never forget one of my theology classes when one of the women in there was like, wait a second. Is there going to be my dog or my cat in heaven? I just hand and head. I can't believe we're having this conversation right now. But I digress. To pet lovers everywhere, I will try very hard not to offend you. I love animals. I believe they belong outdoors. I don't like how much we've domesticated and put them inside. And I also just don't like the animals smell bad. So I'm not like a pet person at all. So I know the pet lovers who know I don't like them that much are going to come at me for this. Bring on the hate mail. I'll take it. But here's what's happening. Massive media criticism has come since the 5th, that is this Wednesday, when Pope Francis, in his catechesis that he's been delivering on St. Joseph, talked about children. Specifically, what he said is how he spoke the other day about the demographic winter there is nowadays. That is this crisis when it comes to demographics with fewer and fewer young people and more older people. And we're seeing this where most nations today are below replacement rate in the western parts of the country and world, in fact. So what he says is we've actually seen essentially where people aren't having children. He says many couples do not have children because they do not want to, or they have just one but they have 2 dogs, 2 cats. Yes, dogs and cats take the place of children. He said, yes, it's funny. I understand. but it is the reality. He then goes on to say, and this denial of fatherhood and motherhood diminishes us. It takes away our humanity, and in this way, civilization becomes aged and without humanity because it loses the richness of fatherhood and motherhood. So in other words, what he's saying to summarize is Pope Francis has said, many people aren't having children or they're limiting the number of children they have, but they're choosing to have multiple dogs, multiple cats. And he's saying, yeah, it's funny. This whole culture where people call themselves dog parents. He said, I understand it's funny, but I also recognize it's a reality and people are losing something important. And that is motherhood and fatherhood. Father Tim, what are your initial reactions to the Pope's comments?
Well, I'm thinking we have all had quite a few years now of practice as Catholics of trying to better understand Pope Francis. We have the surface of what he says, and then we have a lot of time to kind of figure out what he meant at a deeper level. And so we should know at this point, maybe what a lot of people don't understand on social media who don't normally follow Pope Francis and what he has to say is that it's going to take us a little bit of time to understand that you're going to get the headlines of what he said, but what he says underneath that comes from a place of deep love for people who may be struggling to have children, for people who don't have children but really want to have children. And so this all has to be understood within the context of, I think he was giving a catechesis about St. Joseph and
Right.
St. Joseph's fatherhood and how it's a real fatherhood and how it was something that shaped him as a man. And it's so beautiful. You said it. It's that the richness of fatherhood and motherhood is that he said that a man and a woman who voluntarily don't develop a sense of fatherhood and motherhood are missing something fundamental and important. And he invited us to think about this, please. But instead of thinking about it, I think a lot of people just went right to their Twitter and assumed he was saying that pets are bad or people who have pets are going to hell. And that was just their immediate assumption without doing what we've actually gotten pretty good at, I think, is trying to understand Pope Francis better by letting him say what he says, giving it a few days to calm down, and then trying to understand it within the context of the teaching that he was giving.
Well, the cats and dogs on Twitter have not calmed down. It was funny. You see everything from like a cat at the spa with cucumbers on its eyes, getting ready to vamp up into this argument with Pope Francis for a massive backlash. And I find it funny. This is what the Pope is being canceled over by the culture right now, because the cultures tend to be a little more friendly toward Pope Francis in terms of our last 4 popes or so. So it fascinates me because you bring up their pets and suddenly people are up in arms. But I want to dive into one comment because it really made me think about how about a month ago here on Trending, during my weekly happy hour on Mondays. I hope you joined me before on happy hour. If you haven't, you got to join me and let me know if there's a topic you want to hear discussed related to happiness and ultimately striving for joy. And the question was this: are people who have kids happier? And I was fascinated, Father Tim, by the response, because over and over again, people would comment that yes, children can be challenging. Things aren't always easy, but what they didn't know, and I heard this with a resounding choir of voices, that they are more fulfilled. Their life is more fulfilled. Them as an individual, they're more fulfilled. And this makes me think of what Pope Francis made as a comment on this in his general audience, where he said, fatherhood and motherhood are the fullness of a person's life. He said, think about this.
Yeah. And I say it all the time, is that one of my favorite things about the priesthood is being welcomed into homes and into families. And I get to see families who maybe are struggling to have kids, but I also get to be with families where they have like 7 kids. And I see the madness in a house like that when there's like 7 kids and the oldest one's maybe 9 years old. And so there's a lot of kids running around, and there's a lot of fun when I'm there. And I was just at a friend's house the other night, and I'm never going to forget this image, but I think this is what Pope Francis was speaking to. My friend, he's got a pretty newborn daughter. She's maybe 5 or 6 months old, and he was kind of playing with her and just kind of bouncing her around and even kind of hanging her upside down at one point, holding onto both of her ankles very safely, as safely as you can hang a baby upside down, I suppose. But I think anybody would have looked at that like the baby should be freaking out. But I saw the baby's face, and she was so calm, and like it was just this sense of, I'm in my dad's arms. What could go wrong? My dad will never do anything to hurt me on purpose, And so it was just such a beautiful moment of like, how are people who are going to purposely not have children for whatever reason it might be. Maybe the misguided sense that it's going to hurt the environment to have children. But then you have these parents who are learning this beautiful lesson of holding their children and seeing their faces and saying, this kid has something to teach me about what it's like to be a son or a daughter of God. And so I'm never going to forget the face that the little baby was making, being hung upside down. Like, I'm in my dad's arms and everything is perfectly okay. And how I want to be like that in the midst of any struggle. But if anybody is denying fatherhood or motherhood, they don't get to see that lesson face to face. They don't get to let their heart explode with love for their children. And there's a risk that comes with having children, the risk with love. And that's, that certain risk is if you purposefully choose pets over children. That's what Pope Francis is worrying about. Not having pets per se, but if you choose pets over children, you're not going to risk that love. You're not going to learn those lessons. You're not going to be able to look in the child's face and say, that's me and my relationship with the Father, and I need to learn something from these children. And that's something that's a richness that is denied when fatherhood and motherhood are denied.
And it is fascinating because people have a substantial love and appreciation for their pets. That's great, but you don't love a human person the way you love an animal. And if you do, I'm sorry if I'm offending you by saying this, but there's something wrong with that. And I think that that's what is so offensive to so many people, because people are subconsciously replacing human love that they should be expressing toward another human being instead toward their animal. Now, animals are great. They're therapeutic. They can help so much in healing and in therapy. And yes, in a certain respect, is in the event of having something else living in your house, just like having a plant is helpful to have something living in your home. However, it can never replace human connection. And so what's fascinating is you mentioned that being a parent can be risky, and the fact that you can show love and you can even be hurt. Think of all the parents whose children have cut them off, who have done outrageous things, or children whose parents have done outrageous things. Having children, and Pope Francis said this, is a risk. However, he said that it is more risky not to have any children. He said it's more risky to deny fatherhood or to deny motherhood, be it physical and the spiritual. And so he goes on to briefly touch on the spiritual dimension of motherhood and fatherhood, which I think is a very important thing that I'd like to come back and discuss. We'll also discuss this question that we had come in on social media, and that is, what do you do when family and friends are afraid of having children or don't want to? We'll be back with Father Tim Grumbach here on Trending with Timmerie. Also coming up, we've had questions surrounding in-law relationships. Did you know that the Book of Ruth in sacred scripture has a lot to say about actually in-laws? It's all about in-laws. So join me in just a little bit. We'll be here on Relevant Radio, and go answer my questions about having kids on social media at Timmerie, Timmerie. Programming brought to you by Solidarity Health Share. The new Solidarity One program offers expedited sharing of medical bills for even faster service, expanded senior discounts, pharmacy sharing, and greater flexibility to fit any healthcare budget. Learn more at CatholicHealthShare.com.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
So basically, social media is outraged. From social media to Forbes magazine to Vice, you name it. People are upset with Pope Francis because he made comments about how people are choosing to have pets instead of children, and how people are replacing children with pets, specifically couples. We've been breaking down his comments, so if you missed that, be sure to subscribe to the podcast, relevantradio.com/trending, and listen. But I do want to comment on a couple more of Pope Francis's comments and also answer the question surrounding the issue of, are children only for people who are wealthy, as well as what to do when your family and friends are afraid of having children or don't want to. And we'll come to, don't worry, we'll get there, in-law relationships. It's a big question that many people have been asking surrounding the holidays and frequency of time together. Did you know that there's a whole book of the Bible about in-law relationships? name that book if you haven't already. One person has already shared it. Father Tim Grumbach is joining me now here on Relevant Radio. He is a chaplain at Bishop Alamany High School in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and we're discussing, kind of wrapping up our comments about Pope Francis and the encouragement he's giving for people to have children. I want to come to something he said specifically in light of the fact that he gave this within the context of the catechesis on St. Joseph. And he kind of came around to emphasizing that people are taking a greater risk by not having children. And when you do have children, when you're open to motherhood and fatherhood, that essentially this is something that we're denying ourselves if we're missing out on it. And he touches about how spiritual motherhood and fatherhood are so important. Can you talk a little bit about spiritual motherhood and fatherhood versus biological, physical?
Important, especially since a lot of these responses are pointing out how Pope Francis doesn't have any children. I'm like, excuse me, he has over 1 billion children that he's caring for, and he feeds them every day, as one response to that said. Somebody else said that, does this also mean that people who choose to become priests are selfish? And how for some people who make the decision not to have children, that it's an unselfish decision to not have kids. And so it's a lot of, I think, willful misunderstanding of where Pope Francis is coming from, and not trying to understand, again, the context of the catechesis of St. Joseph, and trying to understand his fatherhood as a reflection of the Father's love for Jesus. So to speak of spiritual fatherhood, that's a question that comes up so much, is, especially people who aren't Catholic, asking me why priests are called father when Jesus said, call no man on earth your father. And I think one of the best responses to that is that my fatherhood doesn't come from me. It's not something that I created. It's not something that I initiated. It's something I share in. I share in the fatherhood of the Father, and Jesus's love for the church and the children of the church. And so my fatherhood is an expression of Jesus's own fatherhood of bringing life and through the sacraments into the church. And so at a sacramental level, the spiritual fatherhood of bringing life into the church, of protecting and providing, but also just at the personal level of meeting people, being a part of families, sometimes being called Uncle Tim instead of Father Tim. This is all a reality of spiritual fatherhood that actually I was really concerned about in my own discernment of the priesthood, is wanting to be so much like my own dad, and to have a family, and to love a family the way that my dad loves us, to spend myself for a family as my dad has spent himself for us. It was just such a beautiful vocation to feel called to, but then ultimately to realize that the spiritual fatherhood I was being called to in the priesthood, would allow me to have spiritual children in that sense, that I would have people to spend my life for, that I would be able to care for and provide for and protect people in a spiritual sense. And so the spiritual fatherhood is, again, and that points to the necessity, at least in Roman Catholicism, of celibate priests, that we are married to the church in a sense, and that we can care for people as fathers. I think the analogy could be taken too far sometimes, especially when we're, with the very real responsibility of caring for parishes and administration and taking care of the finances of a parish. It's hard to compare that to what a father must do for his family, but the analogy is still there. And along with spiritual fatherhood comes caring spiritually, but also caring in an administrative sense for a parish. And so to say that we are selfish, for not having children ourselves, that's a real temptation. A priest can become a bachelor and live a free life of, being taken care of by the parish, having food and shelter and a car and everything like that provided by the people, and live as a bachelor that way. But that's the opposite of what we're called to in our spiritual fatherhood, of providing, protecting, and spending ourselves for our people.
It's interesting. I've always heard it put this way, that when we look at ourselves relationally, we should look at all relationships from the perspective of being a son. And so being a son to someone who's maybe older, being mentored by them, you being a mentor to someone else, being fatherly, being a spouse, or being a brother. There's this relational dimension, and the same for women. I think this is understood even more so for women when it comes to spiritual motherhood, specifically because our bodies as women are biologically and physiologically capable to have children, to carry them and nourish them. And so that potency is there, and it reveals that, yes, I may biologically, physically have children, but I'm called no matter what to spiritually give myself in my motherhood. This is written into my body, and I may not have children properly, but this motherhood and fatherhood, this sense of loving mentorship and unconditional love for other people is such an important part of who we are as human beings. And I think that what we risk, when Pope Francis commented that we risk more by not having children as couples, that is, we risk a loss of ever understanding ourselves and experiencing the fullness of life. That doesn't mean you have to have children if you're not married. What that means is if you are married, as Catholics, we believe that marriage and having children, becoming parents, are directly connected. That marriage is for the good of the spouses as well as for the procreation and education of children. That loving commitment and growth and bond that occurs. So this is why Pope Francis, in closing his comments that received a lot of flack because pet lovers everywhere are offended, but I hope you'll go back and listen as we discuss this in the podcast. What he goes in then to conclude is he says, I ask of Saint Joseph the grace to awaken consciences and to think about this. That is about having children. And so as we ponder that for just a moment, I think it's important that we come to this idea, and that is helping other people who are afraid or don't want to have children be more open. And I think that's to be open to the capacity to be more generous, the capacity to embrace a difficult path, to embrace the unknown, challenges, loss of time and sleep and money, to pray also, I think, for a spouse who you want to be a parent with, to pray for a spouse to be a good parent, or to pray for spouses to desire to be parents. I think all of these attitudes and things that we have to understand are very important. And so, Father Tim, I think that really comes back to couples sharing the joy of being parents and having families. And I think that that can go a long ways in confronting a lot of the fear that is present in the culture today.
Yeah, and a lot of that fear comes from a place of being orphaned. And Pope Francis points that out in his catechesis as well, is that there's such a problem with spiritual orphans, but also real orphans of fathers running away, of mothers running away from their responsibility as parents. And I kind of wonder if many of these negative backlash responses come from that wound from their own parents and not wanting to become parents, maybe because they had some poor experience with their own mom or dad. And maybe some people only want to be pet parents because they've seen how difficult it is to be parents and they don't want to take on that responsibility. And so there might be some real wounds that people have experienced that cause them to react this way to Pope Francis and lead to this willful misunderstanding of what he's saying. But ultimately, I think it comes down to Pope Francis has a deep care for the orphaned and the motherless and the fatherless. And he is calling out something great in our hearts that we were made for, is whether spiritual or biological or both, fatherhood or motherhood. And he's calling this out, and people are responding out of fear of that great mission. And that's acedia, that's sloth. That's God has called me to this great mission, but I can't do it by myself. So I feel this paralysis and ultimately this bitterness. And then I go looking for fatherhood and motherhood in other places. And that's his concern. His concern is not that you have pets. His concern is that you choose your pets over children and over this great thing that God has put into our hearts to become mothers and fathers, whether it be biologically or spiritually or both.
And if people kind of even wonder if, has this really gone too far? Even in Spain this week, a law just went into effect basically addressing the idea of quote animal welfare when it comes to when couples divorce. And so trying to give basically the animal more rights when it comes to choosing a fit person for the animal to be taken care of by, basically in an animal type of custody battle. And so we see kind of parts of this in the laws that are coming up. But I want to address a couple more points on this kind of challenge surrounding parents. One of them, I think it comes from Declina, a question that came up on social media asking, what do you do when your family members and friends are afraid of having children and don't want to? And I want to give 7 things to do. And we have a couple other questions as well. But I think one, parents, especially sometimes moms, and I know this is hard to hear, but we have to make sure that we're not complaining all the time to the wrong people. Making it sound as if family life is so dreary and so miserable and so exhausting. It's good to have outlets to share, but we have to understand that sometimes those complaints, that exhaustion, that is legitimate, is scaring other people away, especially if they've already come from negative familial experiences. So I think that's one. And more so, I think us as moms are a little more guilty of this. I think two, to share the joys, but don't sugarcoat things. Share the fun things. Hey, my baby's walking, but hey, my kid's literally rubbing nasty hot dog grease all over my hair as I'm picking her food up off of the floor that she wasted half of it, and now I have to go somewhere. These are silly and fun, but the reality of the day-to-day. Third, I think sharing the growth. You've mentioned many times before, Father Tim, about the impact that it has had on you, seeing your friends become parents. And so I think that these things really transform us. I think for, sharing new perspective on things and how having kids changes your perspective. Just like the story you shared earlier about that friend of yours who's a dad and he was carrying his child, and his child, was hanging upside down, had this utter and complete faith and trust in him. That's pretty profound for someone who didn't have that trust in their parent, but can see another child can have that in theirs. And that maybe they too, despite the brokenness they've experienced, could experience that as well.
Yeah, and I would say, to add to all of this, keep inviting your family members who may be afraid to have children into your family. That's been such a big thing for me as a priest who doesn't have children of my own, is to feel like I'm invested in these children's lives now, because I feel so invited into their lives. And I don't, most of the time I get to see the best of it, but I do get to see the messiness of it sometimes. And I have such a deep love for my friends who are parents, to see the struggle of it sometimes, but also how that's shaping them. And so if you have family members who are afraid of that, keep inviting them into it. Let them see the reality of it, but let them also see the joy of it. And that might be something that begins to transform their hearts, to reconsider, to maybe fall in love with the idea of being parents. And then, as always, we don't want people just to fall in love with the idea of being parents. We want to be there to support them when they start making that decision, so that they don't feel alone. And that might be one of the things that they're afraid of, is feeling alone in having to raise children. So keep inviting them, but also knowing that, you're there for when they're ready to invite you into their lives.
There you go. We're going to have 8 in total then, things for you to be aware of to help encourage people to have children or to help them overcome that fear. So throwing the last few out there, make yourself presentable. Take pride in how you look. I think this is really important. People sometimes go, I don't want to become that. It's actually really funny. So I was visiting my family recently, and my 19-year-old sister had my stroller in the back seat of her car, and she was running some errands and was moving the stroller around, and a couple of high schoolers came by, and they're like, dang, you look good, mama. And like, they're commenting on how great she looks, and like, you still take care of yourself, like, good for you. And my sister's like, so they thought I was a mom, and she's 19. She's like, no, but I got where they were coming from. And it was a reminder for me, don't go out of the house looking like a schlub. If people really think that intensely that moms tend to look a little like kind of withered, maybe we should take that more seriously in terms of how it influences other people to have kids. A couple other things I think that are really important is to share how God really does equip you as a parent. The lack of sleep you get, God equips you to be patient. God equips you to find sleep in other ways. Your time, you lose time, but you gain time in other ways. You prioritize what's important. You suddenly become patient with a child who's rubbing hot dog grease all over your hair, or with nasty diapers that smell terrible. Sometimes it's almost as if you don't even smell them. But I only change my kids' diapers. I refuse to change anyone else's diaper. Always have, always will. Just saying. And I think kind of wrapping this up is kind of helping people to see that being a parent, being made a parent, and having kids, like, overall, it's something attractive. It's something good. Challenging, yes, but it's not meant to be viewed in a negative light, so we can't portray it in that light. Father Tim, there's so many things that can be said, and we could go on this topic forever. Actually, another day I want to talk about how people discuss kids are a luxury item for the wealthy, because that's important, but we'll have to table that for next week. Any final thoughts on the Pope's comments?
Oh, I mean, just from a priestly perspective, like you were saying about the way that people see us and our joy as parents, as spiritual parents, as biological parents, is that, yeah, sometimes people see me and they're like, wow, you look pretty tired, Father Tim. I'm like, yeah, I'm pretty tired. Or sometimes they say, hey, you're looking pretty good right now. Like, you're looking really healthy, as if like I should be looking tired. I could like hear that. Like they just expect the priest to
The
look worn
judgment.
down, but then I look like I'm healthy, and they're like, it's unexpected. And so that's a strange thing to kind of pray with and to wrestle with, how we look. But ultimately, we want people to see the joy coming through our tiredness of being parents, of being mothers and fathers, in whatever sense of the word that might mean for us. And so again, I just want to really hammer that at home. Pope Francis is calling us to something great that's built into our hearts, is to be mothers and fathers. But first we have to be sons and daughters and receive that love from God. So don't forget to pray. If you're parents, please don't forget to pray.
Amen. That's Father Tim Grumbach here on Trending with Timmerie. Thank you so much for joining us, Father Tim. You can follow him on social media. We will tag him and include links to his social media in the podcast notes for today's show. So head over to relevantradio.com/trending to listen to the podcast, share, or wherever you catch your podcast. We'll be right back taking a question about whether or not you should marry someone. If you were with us yesterday, Joe called because he's not sure if he should get married next weekend. We will help him through this and also discuss in-law relationships. Today's programming is brought to you by Kolbe Academy. Offering a customized Catholic curriculum, Kolbe Academy knows the ultimate goal of education is to help our children be saints. More info at relevantradio.com/Kolbe.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Okay, a man is calling. His name's Joe, and he's from New Mexico. He called us yesterday here on Trending, and he's asking us if he should get married or not. He is having some trouble. He's supposed to be getting married not this weekend, but next weekend. He has about a week to go and isn't just having some cold feet or nerves, but outright doubts. Summary, if you've not been with us, I want to go a little bit deeper, Joe. You shared that you are Catholic, that your fiance is not Catholic, that you are not getting married in the Catholic Church. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Welcome back to Trending. So we started off our conversation yesterday, and I invited you to, since you're Catholic, you are called to get married in the Catholic Church. You don't have to marry a Catholic, but the other person is called, if you marry within the church and if you marry them, that they are to agree to raise your children in the faith. So with that having been said, a day's gone by. Where are your thoughts on your entire situation?
Well, she's actually called it off. We tried to talk about our issues last night as well as earlier in the morning, but it seems that she completely just called it off as of now. And that's pretty much where we're at. I feel kind of horrible about it, reason being that I feel like it's something that relationships shouldn't just end like that because you can't seem to communicate, but so far what it's been in the time that I've been with her, it's always been a lack of communication that I feel is coming on her part. But unfortunately, I can't do anything on that other than what I've done, trying.
I'm so sorry, Joe. I can't even imagine where your mind is and your headspace is in the face of that decision. It sounds like she made the decision for you guys. Are you still going to keep trying to figure this out, or do you feel like this has kind of closed that book for you?
I think that I'd be willing to try, but it looks like at least she said, that she was going to be letting her family know, which I guess that kind of like seals the deal on that.
Now, do you want to get married in the Catholic Church? Is that something that's important to you?
I was raised Catholic, and that was always the idea, getting married through a Catholic church. And then I met her, she was Christian and everything, and I guess in a way, it was kind of not necessarily forgotten, but it was kind of like something that just kind of went off and wasn't actually planned out.
Do you go to church regularly, Joe?
I do.
You do. Awesome. Well, I really want to encourage you. This is going to be a challenging time and a transition for you as you figure out next steps. But I want to invite you that if you do proceed to marry your current, or I would say your fiance that you guys just called things off with, or any person that as a Catholic you're called to marry within the Catholic Church, and that if you are still interested in marrying this woman, that inviting her into your church and going through the process of marriage preparation could go a long ways in helping you to further discern if this is the person for you, if that is something you would like to proceed with. I think one of the downfalls of a lot of attitudes with regard to marriage outside of the church is it really does lack that strong marriage foundation in terms of the marriage preparation. So, and not all marriage preparation programs are great. We can work with you to help find some good resources if you do end up deciding to go down that path. But I do highly encourage you in that direction. And Joe, know that I'm praying for you. I know everyone listening right now is praying for you. And don't let this be something that deters you from marriage, but let it be a sign of understanding the great calling to marry within the church, to have the fullness of the sacrament, and to raise any future children with whoever you may marry in the church as well, to pass on your faith. My prayers are with you. God bless you, Joe. And thank you for sharing and asking your questions here on Trending. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio. I promised I would come to the topic of in-law relationships. I've received a ton of questions since October, gearing up for the holidays, and then going through the increased frequency of time with in-laws. Many people have been asking as feelings are high, emotions are frustrated. I've received everything from comments about feeling guilt-tripped or manipulated by in-laws, feeling as if the in-laws only want to see their child and not you, the person who's married into the family. Problems where in-laws will only share certain things with their child and not necessarily with you, intentionally not talking about things in front of you as you've married into the family. I get it. In-law relationships can be so complicated, and I think most people have a pretty difficult time navigating them for many years to come. What I have seen in words of wisdom and advice is I've seen it when people have great in-law relationships, they usually work to establish clear boundaries ahead of time. And they're better usually about not having a chip on their shoulder or being as sensitive. There are a lot of things that have to be let go of, a lot of opportunities for generosity. But what I wanted to do today is turn to a book in the Bible. Did you know that there's actually a whole book in the Bible focused on in-law relationships? I asked you earlier to name that book, and it's actually the Book of Ruth in the Old Testament. It's one of the first handful of books in the Bible right after Judges. So we go through the first 5 books of the Bible. We see this time before the Davidic kingdom where they had judges, that is, specific people were helping to bring the faith to the people. More could be said about that, but I want to focus on the Book of Ruth. So this historically is prior to the Davidic kingdom, prior to the kings reigning over Israel, Judah. So what we see is there is in the lineage of Jesus, and this is part of the reason why this book is in the Bible, we hear the story of Ruth. Now, Ruth is the daughter of Naomi, and the entire book really does have to do, first and foremost, with this relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. And I think some of the most profound things that we can take from this relationship is understanding the profound sense of transformation that occurs within a relationship, any relationship, when you are a follower of Christ. When you're a Christian, when you are a Catholic. Because what we see in the Book of Ruth is a story where Naomi's husband dies and her 2 sons die as well, and she's left with her 2 daughter-in-laws. She encourages both of them to go back to the land of their people, land of their parents, and to go back to their parents' home, as well as to return to their gods, because they were foreigners. They didn't belong prior to their marriages to the chosen people. They were not people who were following, that is, Yahweh. And so what we see is one of the daughter-in-laws does leave after Naomi, the mother-in-law, encourages them. But Ruth, the other daughter-in-law, begs Naomi not to encourage her to leave. In fact, at the beginning of the book of Ruth, we read where Ruth says to Naomi, "For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God." You see, these words from Ruth to Naomi show a particular transformation that occurs. That is, Ruth refuses to leave her mother-in-law out of an act of love. This act of love has been informed by the fact that we see this clear fact that she has converted to the faith of the Hebrew people. And this conversion has led her to not want to leave her mother-in-law destitute, alone, and she also doesn't want to leave the God that she has fallen in love with. That is our Lord, who at the time Jesus Christ wasn't revealed. Remember, this was prior to the incarnation of Christ, but was known as Yahweh. That is God the Father. This idea of fatherhood was somewhat hidden in ancient Israel. And so what we see is, I think, this understanding when it comes to relationships, an ideal in this relationship between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law that can be inspiring for all relationships when it comes to in-laws, that we should all strive for in the midst of our own weaknesses, in the midst of our in-laws' weaknesses. Understanding that we're not called to see ourselves as an island, that we're not supposed to see ourselves as isolated or individualistically only in terms of our decisions, but that what we do and how we interact with others does show the love that Christ is calling us to. Do you want to be a happy person? Do you want to be happier? This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. Monday, join me for our weekly happy hour here on Trending, ultimately working toward the virtue of joy. With me will be Sister Tina Alfieri. She's an addiction specialist, a recovery coach, and she's an incredible spiritual director and a hermit. And she's going to help us to be happier, overcoming bad habits. Join me daily at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.